Tortoise is a newsroom that believes in slowing down to make sense of the world. And on Tortoise News, you get 3 shows that do just that. The Sense Maker brings you one story every day to make sense of the world. Journalists and special guests debate what should lead the news on the news meeting. And in Trendy, Britain's leading polling expert John Curtis and policy guru Rachel Wolfe explore trends in society and public opinion. Make sense of the world by searching for Tortoise News in your podcast app.
Welcome to The Lead from New Lines magazine. I'm Danny Postel, the magazine's politics editor, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. Next week, the Republican Party will hold its national convention in Milwaukee, where it will officially nominate Donald Trump a 3rd consecutive time. Even before Joe Biden's disastrous debate performance on June 27th, polls showed Trump slightly ahead in most of the battleground or swing states that will decide the election. In the aftermath of that debate, that lead has widened. In the 2 weeks since the debate, the national political conversation in the US has revolved almost exclusively around the fate of Biden's candidacy and the deep turmoil within his party, with more and more prominent Democrats, donors, and celebrities like George Clooney urging the president to step aside to avoid a catastrophic defeat in November and the return of Donald Trump to the White House. This unresolved dilemma, this open wound, and ongoing deliberation within the Democratic Party has made the prospect of a Trump victory that much more tangible, more palpable, more real. What would a second Trump presidency look like? How might it be different from the first go? How has the Republican Party and its members changed in the Trump era? And what might this portend for the future? To help us think through these questions, we're joined by Mark Danner, who for the last decade has written a series of probing essays for the New York Review of Books about Trump, the changing contours of Trumpism, and what it's all meant for democracy in the United States. Danner has covered war and political conflict in Central America, Haiti, the Balkans, and the Middle East. He also writes frequently on American politics and has covered every presidential campaign since 2000, the subject of his book, The Road to Illegitimacy, One Reporter's Travels Through the 2000 Florida Vote Recount. Danner teaches at the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and at Bard College. He joins us from Berkeley, California. Mark, welcome to The Lead.
Thank you, Danny. It's good to be here.
So, Mark, I mentioned in the intro this journey that you've been on over your long reporting career, covering both foreign affairs and U.S. domestic politics. If you had to pick a political moment from any of those foreign countries that you think most resembles today's America, what would it be?
I hate to say this, but I think I would pick a moment during one of Haiti's parentheses that existed after the fall of Duvalier and have continued up to the present moment. They use the term parenthesis to describe the period between a dictator, the fall of a dictator, and the rise of a new one. And those moments are usually singularly violent, unpredictable, sporadically absurd, operatic in their politics. And that means that they're a great deal of fun to cover, dangerous as well. And I think that the current moment in the United States reminds me of that, the unpredictability, the way that everyone is on tenterhooks, the way the entire society politicizes itself, that people, to paraphrase Trotsky, you may not care about politics, but politics cares about you. So everybody becomes intensely interested in politics because it becomes a guiding force in their lives. It reminds me, I never thought this would be the case when I was covering Haiti as a young reporter, But in fact, what's going on in the United States now reminds me of politics in Haiti.
That's a very interesting observation. So, Mark, next week, the Republican Party will hold its national convention in Milwaukee, where it will officially nominate Trump for a third consecutive time. You've written about how the Republican Party has been radicalizing under Trump. You've experienced this up close because you were at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021, and witnessed the mayhem. Tell us about that day.
Well, it was very cold, and my feet froze. And I have a very vivid memory of that physical consequence of standing at the ellipse and watching the speeches, not only by Trump, but by Rudy Giuliani, by Donald Trump Jr., by Eric Trump, by various other figures in the Trump circle. I also have a very vivid memory of wandering up by the Washington Monument at the beginning, before I went to watch the speeches, and finding a lot of people in tactical gear with weapons and thinking, gee, I should spend my time covering them this morning. And they were singularly unwelcoming. So I ended up wandering back down to the ellipse and watching the speeches. But it occurred to me in the time since that if I had spent my time with those people, I would have had a very different and more interesting story. I was not surprised by what happened. In fact, when friends asked me, well, why are you going to Washington on the 6th? I would say I'm covering the coup. And that always provoked a bit of laughter, a bit of uncertain, somewhat nervous laughter. But it seemed to me that Trump had been telling us publicly that something was going to happen, and it was likely something was. So when I look back on it, it all seems highly predictable. What I think saved the country at that point was the inherent inability by Trump to actually plan or do anything logical in advance. What also saved the country, it seems to me, was probably the Secret Service agents that refused to take him to the Capitol. Had he been taken to the Capitol, it's quite unpredictable what would have happened, because apparently he planned on confronting Mike Pence. And whether Mike Pence could have stuck to his guns after being confronted face to face by Donald Trump, I think is anybody's guess. So it was a very near thing. You could have had a degree of political confusion, confrontation, and possibly even the actual stealing of an election. The Democrats might have been in the streets afterwards. So one of the things that impressed me was how close we came to something much, much worse than what actually happened on January 6th. The second key point, obviously, was that Milley was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, because I think you could have had a very different result, which is to say, if there had been a Trumpist in that position, Trump very much could have invoked the Insurrection Act. It certainly looked like an insurrection. And I think one of the reasons that the military took so long to get to the Capitol was they were afraid of exactly that happening, that the troops were going to be used somehow by the president. And that caused a certain delay. We still don't know, of course, what happened during that 3-hour, 19-minute delay. Even with all of the investigations that have done, it's still unclear what exactly was going on. But I guess in the end of the day, that's what impressed me the most, that how it was a near-run thing, and how if you'd had a slightly different person in the Oval Office, that may have had a different result.
Are you surprised by how open and brazen Trump and his circle are about the authoritarian designs and policy agenda of a second Trump presidency? I mean, it's all out in the open. You could even say they're leading with it in a sense, right? They've talked openly about invoking the Insurrection Act that you just mentioned on day one of Trump's second presidency, and rolling out the military to suppress protesters, mass roundups, detentions, and deportations of migrants on an unprecedented scale, using the Justice Department to go after political opponents, replacing career civil servants with Trump loyalists, and the list goes on. I mean, Trump recently disavowed Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation-based initiative to plan for and staff a new Trump administration beginning on day one of his presidency. But this is, I think, a bit of implausible deniability, since several of the authors of the project's detailed 900-page blueprint actually served in the first Trump administration and will likely be tapped to serve in the sequel. And also, Trump was already floating a lot of this stuff before Project 2025 started to generate the buzz that it's been getting. In other words, these are very much Trump's own ideas and fever dreams. And so my question, Mark, is typically autocratic figures and demagogues downplay the extremism of their designs to assuage the moderates whose votes they need to get elected. But Trump is actually doing the opposite, isn't he? And it doesn't seem to be hurting him. He got the Republican nomination for the third consecutive time, and he's ahead in the polls now for the general election. So how do you make sense of this?
Well, to answer your first question, I'm not surprised. I'm not at all surprised at the clarity with which he is evoking an autocratic future and with which his followers are filling in the details, coloring between the lines, as it were, about that, what that future is going to look like. I'm not surprised, first of all, because Trump believes that what he is saying is popular among his base, and all indications are that it is, that he's right. They want him to be a strong man. Indeed, him being a strong man is one of the things, perhaps the most important thing, that attracts these followers to him, his strength. And you find his strength everywhere. You know, the fact that he refuses to back down, the fact that he periodically says outrageous things that leave liberals quivering in despair and shock and outrage. Every time there is an incident with that kind of outrage and he doesn't back down, his followers nod at his strength, at the fact that, to put it bluntly, he doesn't give a shit, that he says what he believes and he's willing to do what he says. He demonstrates that with every outrageous comment.
No, they clearly do love that, but he already has them, right? They're going to support him anyway. Doesn't he need the fence sitters and the people the undecided voters, the independents who haven't quite, could go either way?
Yes, he clearly does. And you see, particularly with the negotiations concerning the Republican platform, that he is making certain concessions in that regard. I mean, one of them is he disavowed, as you mentioned, Project 2025. A second is that he disavowed a national law forbidding abortion. That is, he didn't disavow it. I shouldn't say that. He did not include it in the Republican program. So you see him making certain changes to attract moderate voters. But I think he's not able to do that very effectively. I mean, he makes nods in that direction, but he is who he is. That's what his followers like about him, that what you see is what you get. And as for the intellectuals who are putting together 2025, they're not acting surreptitiously because they're proud of what they're doing. None of them feel shame about this. They're proud of the program. They think this is what the United States needs. They think they've done yeoman work in putting it together. Some of these ideas, I would say, elaborate Trump's, but a lot of them are ideas that these political sympathizers have that Trump wouldn't necessarily have, I think. So they've not only filled in the lines, they've come up with a lot of proposals of their own. For example, the essential loyalty test and replacement of so many people in the federal bureaucracy. I don't know that Trump actually thought of that, but his followers have. They're obviously renewing a policy that he tried to institute at the end of his first term that he did institute it actually, and Biden rescinded it when he came in. Schedule H, I think it's called. But these people are not ashamed, They absolutely think what they're doing is the right thing. They think the country is in a perilous state. I mean, one of the craziest things about Trump's debate with Biden was this incredible rhetoric. I mean, we're used to it from him, but it's still shocking about how we're now a third world country. And that left an opening for Biden to say, that's outrageous. How can you say this? He didn't really take advantage of it, as he didn't take advantage of so much else. But he makes incredible rhetorical claims about what a predicament the United States is in that have very little to do with the reality, at least so far as we can see the reality when it comes to statistical presentations of the economy and things like that. It goes back to American carnage. And before that, his speech, his inauguration speech. And, these people on the far right really believe that this is our last chance to save the country, that the country is being taken over by Marxists and communists. They sincerely believe that. And we tend to look at it and think, well, this is some kind of crazy rhetoric and, it's absurd and it's insane. And Trump uses it simply to make this argument and get supporters. But I think when you look at the Project 2025 people, this actually is an accurate description of what they believe. And since it is an accurate description of what they believe, they're very proud that they're putting together such a thorough and systematic answer to this predicament that the country's in. So I think that's partly the reason why it's all up front and why Trump hasn't disavowed it until recently. Those two reasons, actually, his own popularity with his base and his understanding of the reasons for it, and the pride of his intellectual cadre in putting together a solution to the country's problems.
Commenting on the leadership of the Republican Party in the Trump era, you recently wrote, "Perilous as it is to evoke certain political eras, one must go back to Paul von Hindenburg and other titans of the late Weimar Republic to find an elite that so perfectly embodies fecklessness, cowardice, and folly." That line, by the way, brought to mind Mark Leibovich's aptly titled book, "Thank You for Your Servitude," about the Republican Party leadership in the Trump era. So my question, Mark, is what has happened to the grand old party as an institution in the age of Trump?
Well, he's seized control, and he has purged everyone who might question his leadership in a particularly ruthless and savage way. They've done it systematically, they've done it knowingly, and they've done it effectively. And this is not, if you look to the authoritarian playbook, if such exists, you'll see that happening again and again when it comes to authoritarian regimes. Remember Hitler's Night of the Long Knives was done rather more dramatically and rather more bloodily, but a similar coalescence and concentration of power was the subject of that political violent action as well. I think there's a basic misunderstanding about how people act politically. We seem to think that the normal action of people under pressure for their jobs is to say, I believe in the country, I believe in the founding documents, I believe in the Constitution, I denounce this leader corrupting the Constitution. I step forward and sacrifice myself on the altar of constitutionalism. I will have nothing to do with Donald Trump.
And a few have done that, right? Like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Mitt Romney.
A very few. And I think that this is par for the course, that in situations like this, and there have been situations like this, the number of people who are infected with what Agnieszka Holland, the great filmmaker, called the virus of justice, are very few. They're very few. The people who are willing to give up their jobs people who are willing to give up their positions, people who are in a position of power and are willing to say, that's it, I'm going to become a private citizen, like Liz Cheney did. There are very, very few people who are willing to do that as a matter of principle. And I smile mildly when I see on the cable news shows people saying, well, what's happened to the Republican Party, and denouncing people for their lack of backbone. Because maybe I'm a dark skeptic here, but I think that's the human condition. I think that most people, when confronted with an unstoppable force like Donald Trump, and having been made to choose between their career and denouncing the leader and taking an overt opposition position, the number of people who are willing to do that is a small minority. And that is what has unfolded in the Republican Party. And I must say, I'm not sure under a similar process of change and evolution whether something terribly different would happen under the Democratic Party. I mean, it would be different because the party is a coalition rather than a political party per se. But I think you would still have an awful lot of people who would go along. I don't mean to have a terribly dark view of human nature, but I simply think that's the way things happen. It's the way it happened in Eastern Europe. You know, it's the way it happened in Nazi Germany and in fascist Italy. And I think Americans are no exception. I mean, it seems, well, we have at our founding a series of documents and principles, but that hasn't made a great deal of difference, I don't think.
But might the issue go even deeper than that, in terms of there's the personal ambition or cowardice that you talk about, Mark, but there's also a sense amongst some Republicans that Trump has brought something. He has added something to the equation of the party that is perhaps irreplaceable. You quote Lindsey Graham, one of the most servile of those Republican leaders, Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who said that Trump can, quote, make the Republican Party something that nobody else I know can make it. He can make it bigger. He can make it stronger. He can make it more diverse. And he could also destroy it. And that last point is crucial. You make an interesting observation when you write, there's personal fear of Trump's violent supporters, but also an acknowledgement of and even attraction to the harsh male dominance he embodies, so critical to the successful autocrat. Lindsey Graham said, you know what I like about Trump? He asked a crowd of Republicans. Everybody was afraid of him, including me. So talk about that fear factor, that sort of attraction-repulsion dynamic at work in Trump's relationship with the party, which he has now, as you say, made his party.
Well, I think the fear factor and the dominance, I call it male dominance, although there's certainly a female could be in the same position, I think, but with some changes. But I think the male dominance is absolutely necessary to his political success. I mean, if you go to a Trump rally, it's an amazing display, of people wearing sweatshirts and T-shirts and carrying flags. It'll be Trump's head on Rambo's body. There's this emphasis of his masculinity and his power. And I think I said earlier that one of the things that attracts people is the fact he doesn't give a shit, that he'll say what he believes. And this saying what he believes, this strength, gives them, his followers, the belief that he will do what he says, that there's a general attitude about politicians among his followers that you vote for them, they get up to Washington, D.C. or the state capitol or wherever, and they don't do what they say. They become like everyone else. That's why you have this image of a swamp. A swamp, you step on the ground and the ground looks solid, but it's soft and it sucks you in. So all of these politicians come from wherever they're coming from, and they become transformed by the swamp. And this harsh male dominance and this refusal to buckle to the way other people think is one of the signs that shows you that Trump is not going to do that. And, the elite press, one of the givens about Trump is that he lies continually. And I remember saying in a rally after the election, I asked someone, why are you so convinced that he won the election? And this person said to me, well, Trump says it, and he would never lie. He would never lie. And I was very struck by that. He would never lie. That the impression of him, of his followers, is just entirely different than the elite press and people in the Democratic Party who view him as this flagrant liar and this man who, the old Hollywood joke is, how do you tell he's lying? His lips are moving, right? That's the way he's viewed. And his followers view him as a truth teller. And to me, that's a fascinating thing. Partly it has to do with a difference in belief in what truth is. It has to do with information, statistics, things like that.
Versus narrative and emotion and instinct.
Exactly. Very true. He tells a story that's true. Mm-hmm. And all of the sources of these statistics are, by definition, for his followers, compromised. They're lies. Right. Just the way it's been so easy for him to compromise the entire justice system by saying, this is, I'm being railroaded. This is a disgrace. The system is rigged. Well, a Democrat will say, well, look this is the district attorney of New York City. He doesn't work for Biden. This is 12 citizens who are voting in a jury. They don't work for Biden. If you look at the facts here, none of this is true. But a follower of Trump just hears a narrative that the system is rigged, the whole system. It's rigged against people like me and like him.
And that feels true to them. And I would say that it's actually since Trump's conviction, the Trump base has doubled down on that kind of Trump as victim of the system, but also as a kind of a badass, criminal, outlaw, gangster. Yeah. They like it. I was just at a Trump rally in Racine, Wisconsin, where I saw, you were talking about the T-shirts and the imagery. There were a lot of T-shirts, as you say, sort of this Rambo image of Trump, but also Trump as like gangster, Trump as badass, Trump as someone, an outlaw but he's our outlaw. He's a bad hombre, but he's our bad hombre. He's the baddest of all bad hombres. And there were shirts saying, I'm with the convicted felon. I'm voting for the felon. They're embracing that.
Right. They're embracing that. And it's interesting that on the one hand, you have Rambo and you have the convicted outlaw, the baddest of baddies. Absolutely. And then you have Jesus. You have Trump being chosen by Jesus, which is a very popular image. And of course, Jesus died for our sins, right? His Trump's imagery, I am your retribution. They get to me before they get to you. They're trying to get to you, and they get to me because they're trying to get to you. This is Christian imagery, for God's sakes, which is fascinating to me because, he is not, how much he went to church as a kid, I don't know, but it wasn't very much. And, it's as if he has come through his own political instincts to this imagery of Trump on the cross, which I just think is a fascinating phenomenon. And this idea, this kind of identification of the leader's body with his followers is something that you had with Hitler and Mussolini as well. It's very prevalent in the history of autocracy. And it's fascinating to me because Trump, he doesn't read. There's no way he knows very much about Hitler or very much about Mussolini. Yet he comes to a lot of these political stratagems almost naturally. His political instincts are not by any means infallible, but they're very interesting. The idea that someone who's been indicted for 80-some felonies and so on can so adroitly say this proves the system is rigged and dovetail it perfectly into the election narrative. I mean, it's fascinating to see that. I'm always amazed. He's not a learned man, but he does have a kind of instinctual political sense that is remarkable. And that brings us back to Lindsey Graham, your original question, who I think enunciated feelings that are held by many members of the Republican Party, even those who really hold their nose to support him, which I would say when it comes to the party is maybe the majority still. That is, they believe he can make the party much bigger, that he's really made it into a working class party. If he wins this time, it'll be not because he moved to the center, even though he's making gestures of doing that. It won't be because he moves to the center. It'll be because he gets more voters from the right to come out to vote. More voters who don't normally vote will come out to vote. It'll be like 2004, the second Bush election, George W. Bush, where that election was not held in the middle of the political spectrum, as most American elections are. Karl Rove went to the right. And I think will also be the story of this Trump election if he is elected. Although it's very hard, obviously, with the current situation with Biden, it's very hard to predict now.
You also described the GOP in its present incarnation as, quote, a white nationalist populist party with a suburban business class appendage, which increasingly finds itself holding its nose at the stench of the white unwashed. And I think this speaks to the party's cross-class composition. But for a second, let's talk about that suburban business class appendage. Part of that bloc, especially educated women in the suburbs, has peeled off over issues like abortion and maybe over the QAnonification of the party. Others in that sort of suburban business class remain on the Trump train, even if, say, they supported someone else in the 2016 primary, like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or John Kasich. But the Democrats are banking on peeling off more of those suburban professionals than seem to be actually peeling off. A lot of them are staying with Trump, despite the conspiracism, the authoritarianism, and that sort of stuff usually doesn't appeal to that social stratum, and it might even alienate it. But maybe there's something else going on. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think the first thing that's going on is we really don't know. Polls this early, and it still is pretty early, I mean, pre-Labor Day polls are not necessarily going to indicate what's going to happen in the election. So a lot of those people haven't really turned their eyes to the election yet. And I think that's also true because now there's such turmoil on the Democratic side. I think that the strategy of the Biden people was to peel off those people using abortion and democracy as the major issues. So to pull off especially women in the suburbs who already have great doubts about Trump, frighten them with images of autocracy and images of back alley abortions, and to pull them off and to use that group, so-called Biden Democrats, you could call them, after Reagan Republicans, to win the election. Whether that will now be the strategy or not, I mean, there's such turmoil on the Democratic side, it's hard to tell what will happen. I mean, among those people itself, I think the number who are appalled by Trump is very substantial. And the question is whether they can be brought to vote for the Democratic candidate. I think the major problem with voting for Biden was people's worry about whether he was up to the job, which obviously has gotten worse after the first debate. But I think many of those people would have come around and voted for Biden, as they did in 2020. Whether more of them would have, I don't know, and perhaps we'll never know, depending on whether Biden is or is not the candidate. I think that was the Biden campaign's theory of the case, that those were the people they were going to get. They were going to be able to get them. They were going to flood the zone with abortion and choice ads, that they'd flood the zone, depending on how well they worked, with democracy ads. I mean, it's a bit of a dispute how well democracy does. In the 2022 midterms, it seemed to be very effective. Whether they would have doubled down on it this time around, I'm not sure, because, as we say, we don't even know who the candidate is going to be now. But I think that was still their theory of the case, that was the targeted tranche of voters, women in the suburbs, suburban country club Republicans, suburban soccer moms. That's who they were targeting. And then obviously making a huge get out the vote drive for their supporters.
So on this democracy point, this is very important, I think. You close one of your essays with this disquieting observation. History offers notable examples of dictators who have come to power through elections, but it's hard to think of one who attempted to cling to power through a coup and failed, and to whom the polity, in its blithe unconcern, offered the chance to try again. And that point about the polity's blithe unconcern poses a pretty sobering question. What if democracy as an issue in the election just isn't that compelling or important to voters? I mean, consider that Republican voters have chosen Trump as their standard bearer after everything a third straight time. And unlike in 2020, when he was the incumbent, there were actual alternatives this time around. But primary voters went overwhelmingly with Trump. And Trump is now ahead in the polls for the general election. Not only that, and this is really shocking, according to a recent poll that I sent you the other day by the Washington Post and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, in 6 swing states that Biden narrowly won in 2020, more than half of voters classified as likely to decide the presidential election say that threats to democracy are extremely important to their vote for president, but more of them trust Trump to handle those threats than Biden. And most believe that the guardrails in place to protect democracy would hold even if a dictator tried to take over the country. How do you make sense of that?
Well, I think, like many polls, it's very difficult to make sense of that. It's clear that the democracy rhetoric, it may very much catalyze Democrats and independents to go to the polls. It's clear it does not affect Republicans, that if you voted for Trump before, it probably is not going to convince you to call him a dictator in waiting. So I think the poll results are confounding when it has to do with democracy. And I think it's clear that the Democratic argument is not going to actually change people's minds when it comes to Trump. It might vitalize those soccer moms to come to the polls. So it would targeted at these vulnerable groups, vulnerable from the Democratic point of view, it might mobilize voters, but it will not convince anybody. And I think that number about people who trust Trump to protect democracy is an amazing number, which says a lot about polling. It says a lot about communication in this country, about the press, about how stovepiped we've all become and what we're reading and listening to. To go back to that quote that you read from the end of one of my pieces, I think one of the great stories of our time is the fact that the country, having witnessed an attempted coup on national television, has been unable to protect itself from the perpetrator. That is, it's an amazing thing that the government, such as it was, came in and puttered around and didn't indict him and, waited for a year and a half, essentially, before it moved to get a special counsel and actually act against Trump. I think that's an incredible phenomenon. And it suggests a kind of decadence in the system that is something we should ponder. That, I keep thinking that the classical Rome would have known what to do with Trump. When Catiline tried to overthrow the government, Cicero responded. They recognized a threat to the state. a crime against the state. And that's what January 6th was. It was a crime against the state. And that's distinct. That's in effect a kind of treason.
And there was a brief moment on January 6th itself and in the few days afterward where even Republican leadership seemed to see it as a crime against the state and get off the Trump train and kind of, come to grips with what had happened, including Lindsey Graham. But it dissipated very quickly.
It did. It dissipated in the kind of grand sunlight of the leader's personality. The way he was able to summon these people down to Mar-a-Lago, the way he was the center, the sun, and everyone else was sort of weakened by his gravity. It was a remarkable thing to see, but I'm not talking necessarily about McConnell and the other people, Kevin McCarthy, the other people who for a brief time denounced him. I'm talking about the other side, the fact that the Democrats got in. And I think one of the reasons is we have no tradition of prosecuting the former leader in this country. It simply isn't something we do. I mean, in Haiti, which I mentioned earlier, this is a regular thing. A new government gets in, they prosecute the government before. I mean, it's usually the previous president flees to Jamaica or New York or Paris, and all of his belongings are taken. And there's a book about it. The Nation Demands Accounts, it's called, by a Haitian historian. So there's a big tradition in other countries. In this, there wasn't one. And you had in Merrick Garland a figure who wanted to be above that, who didn't want to be the first attorney general to prosecute the previous president. And that's very bad, because I think what would really protect us, the thing that should have protected us from Trump, was prosecuting Trump. And it was predictable that the impeachment wouldn't work. I mean, one of the things that the Trump era has shown us is that impeachment is wholly not up to the task when it comes to dealing with high crimes and misdemeanors. It doesn't work in a party system. And of course, the founders were not thinking of a party system, but it doesn't work. So he needed to be prosecuted, and he needed to be prosecuted right away. I mean, he did what he did publicly. I mean, it's sad when you have to take on this kind of political task that you don't want to, but as Attorney General, I think that's what should have happened. I mean, Biden let it be known that he didn't want that to happen. And I think that must have weighed heavily in Merrick Garland's considerations. But it seems to me, the end of the day, we're in this situation in part because the incoming government didn't do what it was obligated to do, which is to deal with someone who attempted to overthrow the government in a coup d'etat.
And you've called this a slow motion coup. This is the title of a series of essays that you've been writing for the New York Review of Books. What do you mean by slow motion coup?
I mean that as opposed to the coup on the 6th, we're going to have a slow motion return to power, which will, who knows how this election will go and whether Republican legal wizards will challenge it. I mean, we're not at a point where we can predict it now, but I think that Trump will try to come to power through any means possible. And that includes making it more difficult to vote, which Republicans have already done in many states, including the swing state of Georgia. It includes challenging results at the polls. It includes lying, cheating, all of the things that Trump is known for. That's what I mean by a slow motion coup, that it will be a slow process of trying to come back to power that will use any means necessary, including assaults on the electoral system and electing people to Secretary of State positions, for example, who are sympathetic to Trump. So the system itself is being challenged, is really what I mean by slow motion coup.
Mark, you've been sounding the alarm about the threat that Trump poses. One of your essays carries the resounding title, "We're in an Emergency, Act Like It." How would you respond to skeptics who would say, we were told in 2016 that a Trump presidency would mean the end of democracy, And yeah, Trump did a lot of damage, but democracy basically survived intact. So why should we believe these apocalyptic admonitions this time around? How would you respond to that?
It's a good question. I'd say, first of all, that the warnings in 2016 came to fruition. He launched a coup, the first in American history. And as I said earlier, it was a near run thing. The results could have been different, I think. So the predictions in 2016 were true. And the predictions now are bolstered by Project 2025, which lays out a pretty clear roadmap to a more authoritarian system. I think you have this outline of what he's planning to do that's no secret. And I think that, you can't simply say, well, he'll be an autocrat, he'll destroy the system. I mean, obviously, if he gets in power, there'll be a series of battles within the government and among its branches, which will decide how much he can change the system. It'll be different, as many, many, many have observed. It'll be different this time around because he will be surrounded by loyalists, not by so-called adults in the room. And many of these loyalists will be much more not only unthinking when they do what he says, but much less worshipful of the law, as many of the adults in the room were the last time. So you will have people actually doing what he says, coming up against the law, really going right up to the edge and possibly over it. I think they will ignore possibly court injunctions, even as they try to populate the judiciary with their own loyalists, with people like Eileen Cannon in Florida, who's presiding over the documents case, judges who really are partisans. I think you'll see a lot more of those, but you'll also see ignoring injunctions from the courts. I think that'll happen. I think he will do much more what he says this time around. So I don't fault those people who are skeptical, because I think we do have a system that is built to protect against this. I mean, it was put together to protect against exactly this thing, but it's going to be tested dramatically. And we found on the last go around that many of what we thought were laws, were legal admonitions, were in fact norms. And that if someone is, for example, the emoluments clause, which forbids someone, a president, from benefiting financially from office, from gifts from foreign envoys or whatever, it proved to be completely useless. It proved to be completely unenforceable. And I think that was true of a lot of things last time around. And you're going to see it tested again in a similar way. Those people who are doing 2025 are looking at the weaknesses in the Constitution. There's secret parts of 2025. You'd think that 900 pages made public would be enough. But in fact, there are large numbers of executive orders and other things that they have put together that have not been made public. So those are going to come out at the very beginning of a second Trump term.
So, Mark, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, where do you stand, or what thoughts do you have on the Biden dilemma? I mean, it seems that all of the options available have downsides, major downsides, right? Biden refuses to exit and loses to Trump, and the huge number of people who called for him to step down will be furious that they weren't listened to. The other option, Kamala Harris becomes the candidate and loses to Trump. Biden's supporters will be furious that he was forced out. It doesn't seem as likely as it did at one point, but it could be that someone else is selected either through a mini primary or at the convention in Chicago and loses to Trump. And again, Biden's supporters will be furious. But all of these, we don't have a controlled experiment. We can't test these options against alternatives. It's a gamble. And where do you see it?
Well, I see it as a terrible dilemma. I'm frankly torn, because I was believing that if things had continued the way they were, I wouldn't say confident, but I felt that Biden would win. My analysis of what the numbers showed and what past history showed before the debate was I was fairly confident that Biden would end up winning the election. So what has happened during the debate, and since the debate, has been immensely painful to me. On the one hand, his weaknesses were evident. He's showing his 81 years, obviously, and he had, as he said, a bad night. On the other hand, we've seen a kind of democratic self-destruction in the time since that is rather appalling and is painful. You're not going to win an election when you say publicly again and again that you're not going to win the election. And that is what the poobahs of the Democratic Party have been saying since the debate. We're not going to win. We're going to lose. And it's like, that's not the way to win. So I've been appalled at what's happened. When I look at the logistics of this, I feel like there's a lot of nonsense being talked. The idea of a mini convention, I think, or a mini primary, I think is going to be very hard to do. I think the only practical alternative is Kamala Harris, who can take over the campaign, who can take over the money, because the other candidates, it's legally questionable whether they can take that $200 and some million and use it for another campaign. I mean, maybe they'll be able to do it somehow, but the current FEC regulations suggest that they couldn't. She could. She would simply be moving up on the ticket. She could retain his entire organization and so on. Of course, people aren't pointing this out, I think, because Kamala Harris is a figure who splits the Democratic Party. And so they don't want to make it, well, do we want Harris or do we want Biden? They'd rather make it, do we want Biden or do we want another, an unnamed Democrat? I mean, we know all the people who have been suggested, but there is a real sense here. It's what happens in polling when you say, would you vote for Trump or an unnamed Democrat? You know, the numbers are higher on the Democratic side. And that's exactly what's happening now, because people don't have to actually settle on a Democrat or settle on the way you'd be chosen. They just think we need somebody else. So on the one hand, this is a self-fulfilling process. I mean, all the people denouncing Biden and saying he should get out are in a sense destroying any chance he could have to win.
If he stays. But the idea is that their arguments, their urging that he get out is geared toward the goal of perhaps Kamala Harris defeating Trump because they see Biden as incapable of defeating him. So it's only destructive, in other words, it's only self-fulfilling self-destruction if Biden refuses to leave and remains the candidate.
I know that. It only is, well, you could say it this way. It only is if Biden would have lost anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
And
we have no way of knowing.
There's no control group. We'll never know that for sure. But I know, having covered elections, one of the things I think a weakness of intellectuals in looking at elections is they tend to assume that people know a lot more than they do. The vast majority of people do not follow this stuff, do not know anything about policy at all. Policy is much overrated. There's an old political nostrum that says policies don't win elections, constituencies win elections. Policies are only about getting constituencies. And there are a lot of people out there who have never heard of Gretchen Whitmer.
Right.
And who know that Joe Biden is the president.
Right.
And who would just vote for Joe Biden because he's the Democratic president. That's it. And all of those people we're essentially saying goodbye to and trying to get them to take somebody in Biden's place. I'm not saying that now, the current situation, it's almost obvious that we have to have somebody in his place, although how that's going to work is not clear. But I do feel there's an extent to which the Democrats have done this to themselves. And it gives me a great deal of anxiety. Because I think one of these other candidates, making them a national candidate in 11 weeks is going to be hard. I mean, the time between the convention and the election is very short. So anyway, I'm sitting here with a great dilemma. I wish I could be as certain as George Clooney. And I often have wished that.
Well, Mark Danner, thank you for joining us on The Lead.
Thank you, Danny. It's really great to be here, and it's great to talk with you.
This has been The Lead, a podcast from New Lines Magazine. This week's episode was produced by Finbark Anderson and hosted by me, Danny Postel. For more episodes like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favorite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.